Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution on this wonderful evening. Before I introduce our main event, I just wanted to reintroduce the Renaissance series as a whole. Can I just ask a question, hands up, for those who've actually attended a previous Renaissance talk so far? Oh wow, okay, that's getting on for 50% here. That's very good. And have you enjoyed it? That's also reassuring, and I'm sure this was the winter season that is finished. So that ran from September to December, was roughly about 10 or 12 talks. The spring season is already upon us. That runs from January to the end of March, and that will consist of 14 talks. So, as you already know, our interpretation of the Renaissance is very different to the standard interpretation of the Renaissance, where it always gets viewed through Jacob Burckhardt, and it's really something that is relating to the arts and happened in Italy. Whereas our interpretation of the Renaissance spans 3 centuries, from 1350 to 1651. The reason why it's 1651 rather than 1650 is because we wanted to get the publication of The Great Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes into the Renaissance. But not only does it cover 3 centuries, it also covers multiple continents. So we're covering the East and the trade routes, we're covering the discovery of the New World, and of course we're covering also Europe. So we didn't want this just to be Eurocentric. And the third difference, I suppose, is that we're covering lots of different disciplines. We're covering things from architecture to art. We're talking about politics. We're talking about cartography and geography. We're talking about world affairs. We're talking about philosophy, etc., etc. And, this in history, of course, as we do today. So this is really quite a ramble through the world and its history at a very pivotal point in time. And I hope that we can learn a lot from the Renaissance in the current times in which we live. So I look forward to tonight's talk in terms of the birth of news, which is we are awash with news. So it's good to go back to the birth of news. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Joad Wren, who is an academic, an educator, and an author who has authored and written and edited at least 12 publications. And obviously he's here to talk about the Great Exchange, the birth of news today. But he's also written his first novel, All the Colours You Cannot Name, which is quite interesting. There's obviously a spectrum of colours which nobody knows about. How many colours of blue do we have, for example? So that would be worthwhile exploring. Unfortunately, he's not here today. We do have copies of his book, which he's going to talk about today. That would be really useful. But he's also written a book on Milton, which is for sale, and also he is in the process of publishing a book on utopias, the use of utopias. And I'm not sure whether utopia is spelled with a U or an EU, because that makes a big difference. So we shall see. But yes, so Joad has written many books. He went to the University of East Anglia and to Oxford. He also taught at both of these universities, as well as Queen Mary's College in London, in Aberdeen, and he's also taught at the Sorbonne, before then retiring from academia and focusing on his writing. And he's also familiar, he's really a bit of a cultural celebrity, because he does feature on various podcasts, radio programs, and even on TV. So I'm sure you will join me to give a very welcome to Joad Wren.
Thank you, Andreas, and thanks for coming out this evening. How can you possibly write a history of news? News is a physical thing, it's a material thing, it's a battle, it's a scandal, it's a disaster, but it's also a letter, it's a newspaper, it's an announcement, it's something we routinely read and are familiar with, and it becomes a matter of habit. We access it at particular times and in particular places and in particular forms. These might be phones or tablets or computers, or radio, or television, or pamphlets, or printed newspapers, or conversations, often with someone who has heard the news relayed by one of these media, and then chooses to pass it on to us. News media are produced by human activity, sometimes commercial, sometimes merely through friendship, and they're routinely moved by human activities such as carts and horses, or telegraph, or the printing press. News is always in motion, so how can it be possible to write a history of something that is at the same time personal and universal, so trans-historical and yet ephemeral, something that covers vast spaces and yet inheres in small handheld objects, something that is material and yet at the same time intangible. I don't know. I'm going to begin, though. It took me many hundreds of pages to even begin to end the first part of the answer to that question. But I'm going to begin with 3 events from 15th century Europe, events which at the time may have seemed very ordinary and quotidian, but I think we can place them in a pattern that begins to help us think about what news is. And the first, it's 1419. Oh, sorry, that's Europe. We'll come back to that. It's 1419, and Biagio Dolfin, the Venetian consul in Alexandria, is reading his correspondence. First, he reads a letter sent from Crete by another merchant, Giacomo Bragadin, in which Bragadin writes, "By my hand, we have no news by the end of this day. At this time, by ship, nothing has come to us, except that from Venice of the 13th of December. I have a copy of the news, which I will send to you, as you will see immediately below." Now, this is a standard letter from a merchant reporting the news. Notice how often he tells you there's no news. It's a very important part of reporting the news. It really is an important part of reporting the news that you say when there's no news. It matters. And then he copies out a newsletter and bundles it in with his own letter. He says, "I have a copy of the news which I will send to you, as you will see immediately below." Dolfin also receives a letter from his cousin, Marco Morosini, which contains more economic and more general news. There's a long disquisition about the movements in the price of pepper. And the third letter in Dolfin's mailbag is a letter from Venice, written by his uncle, Antonio Morosini, who's quite well known for writing a history of the city, a chronicle of the city. And in this, Antonio passes on some local news, but also includes a series of short paragraphs of diverse news from various sources. And these paragraphs indicate the dates and, albeit unevenly, the origins, the place of origin of the news. So one of the paragraphs begins, "By the last letters we have from Bruges," and so on. The paragraphs in this letter are raw and factual. There's news of an ambassador from Cremona, of the Pope, of the siege of Genoa, news from Hungary, England, and Albania. And the letter is almost entirely lacking in any personal avuncular information. So in these letters in Dolfin's mailbag, we see, in the hands of an expatriate Venetian in Alexandria in 1419, the entire future history of the newspaper. In what way? Attention to dates, where news comes from, the systematic duplication of news, the physical bundling together of newsletters and personal letters, the assemblage of really quite heterogeneous things that are all understood to be news in one way or another. And this is increasingly important in a world that faces an increase in the amount of information that's circulating and the huge problems of information management and overload that that's going to bring. We see him copying out short paragraphs of factual information. Right, we'll come back to that. Second example. This is in 1486, and it's Lorenzo di Giovanni Tornabuoni standing in a a piazza in Florence. And he's standing in a circle of many noble citizens, he says, when one of them reads out a letter. It's a letter from Portugal. And the author of the letter has had a conversation with someone lately returned from Guinea, who describes the conversion of a king there to Christianity. And there's not a great deal of news from sub-Saharan Africa in Florence. So Lorenzo runs home to write a letter to Benedetto Dei, who lives in Milan. He owes Benedetto, who's a great man of letters, this worthy and memorable news, he says. So this is a kind of transaction, a reciprocal exchange of news sent by post. And so this is another event that involves copying of news. It involves travel. It involves movement between the spoken word and the written. It involves the importance of public spaces and postal services. The news in Tornabuoni's letter begins with human migration, sailors probably travelling from Guinea, which leads to spoken news in Portugal, a letter sent to Florence, a conversation in a Florentine piazza, a record of that conversation sent in a letter to Milan, and then presumably, because Benedetto is a great man of letters, he then sends that news on to his various friends. Thirdly, my third example is from Venice in 1503. The merchant Michele Foscari receives a packet of news. It includes, this packet, a letter from his agent in Alexandria, Marco Zorzi, hence the picture of Alexandria here. But it's got other things in it as well. It's another bundle. In addition to Zorzi's letter, there's a letter which Zorzi asks Michele to pass on to a third party. And there's another document, and this last document is explained in a cover note, which is literally a cover note, because Zorzi writes this note and wraps it round all the other documents and then seals it. And this cover note explains that just before he was about to send on these other documents, he received this attached document, which is an Arabic letter detailing the movement of spices. In fact, it's a list of ships that have arrived in Jeddah, which is the Red Sea destination of vessels in the Indian spice trade. It's a list of ships that is organized by place of origin, and then details for each of the ships the spices it carries and the quantities of those spices. And this is valuable information because Foscari's company is trying to work out whether there are spices that aren't already involved in European trade, which they might take advantage of. But in order to work out whether this is going to be possible, he needs to know the arrival, the time of arrival in Cairo, and whether that will coordinate with the narrow season in which winds make traffic between Alexandria and Venice possible. So Zorzi translates this memorandum from Arabic to Venetian, and then he puts it in with his other letters and wraps them all round with his cover note, which he then seals. And I think it's very interesting. This is already standard practice for merchants by 1500, how you manage multiple documents in correspondence. And also significant is that Zorzi has received this letter from a scribe of the Nazir al-Khas, and he describes this man as a dear friend. And in other letters, he describes the Maghrebis, as he calls them, as his dear friends, and says they're actually much more reliable people than the Italians in Egypt. But this is another important pattern in the future history of newspapers. Zorzi's affections and his news are not limited by regional or cultural or even religious identity. It's in the very nature of news that it can't observe these boundaries. It has to cross the boundaries between cultures, between languages, between news, between religions. And its reliability, the reliability of news, the credibility of news, doesn't depend on the religion or the politics or the political affiliations of the person who passes it on to you. We'll come back to that. So, those three events from the, kind of 14th, beginning of the 15th century, they all tell us something about news at this time. And of course, news is much older than this. I'm talking about this as a kind of birth of news, but I mean it's the birth of a particular kind of processing and managing news. As far as written records go back, there is news. In Persia under Cyrus the Great in the 6th century before the Common Era, and in ancient China, there are postal services already for communicating written information. But something happens around 1400. We see something new. We see merchants and diplomats beginning to standardize ways of organizing the news on paper. They copy things, they put things in bundles, and they exchange. And they formulate short paragraphs of news, often identifying the date and the place of origin. And when a piece of news is too long to put in a short paragraph, they write a separate document and send it as a companion piece. They don't fit it into a paragraph. You need an attachment for a longer form piece of news. So we're looking at forms of information management. And this is a response to the increase in information that's available, around 1400 because of communications between especially merchants and diplomats. And these forms of information management, I think, may seem quite familiar. While the Postal Service may seem like ancient history in 2026, things like sending attachments and cutting and pasting, juxtaposing short reports with long-read essays, and compiling newsletters from other sources, bundling together other documents in a newsletter. All of these might well seem like familiar activities to us. But I particularly want to focus on paragraphs. This is one of the most interesting information management strategies for me, and one of the most extensively used in early modern Europe, because it became, in the course of the 15th century, the unit of news. The unit of the news was not a newspaper, it was a paragraph, and paragraphs were shared in lots of different kinds of ways. Ambassadors and news writers and diplomats would copy excerpts from letters, and they would leave some space around it. And these chunks of text are immediately recognizable as paragraphs. And you can see an example here. The paragraph has a formula. Part of the convention of writing a paragraph of news, among people who are doing it in some kind of professional capacity in particular, is you begin each paragraph with a marker of time and place. So it might read, for news, we have by letters from the 7th of Geneva that at near 5 in the evening that the Turkish and French fleets entered the port of Villafranca together, and it is said that they there want to make a fortress so they can stay safely over the winter and the spring. And when people copy out these paragraphs, so you might receive this in a letter and you might pass it on in another letter, or you might print it in your newspaper. We'll come to that later. When people copy out the news, they preserve this information about time and place. And they add their own time and place to the paragraph. So when someone copies a paragraph that begins, by letters of the 1st of October, we hear that there was a great battle at Ragusa, which is Dubrovnik. So when they copy out the letter, they might write, by letters from Rome of the 29th of October, we hear that the news was received there, the first of the same, the same of a great battle at Ragusa. So they preserve the information in the initial paragraph when they copy out the paragraph. They retain what we would call metadata. Now, for me as an historian, this was an incredible gift because I was able to spend 20 years of my life scraping and analyzing metadata. Because it enabled me to trace the flows of news around Europe. Paragraphs moved between cities, between languages, between manuscript and print, and print and back to manuscript and back to spoken conversations again. Paragraphs of news moved between different genres, between republics and monarchies, between various religious confessions, between calendrical systems. And interestingly, when they moved between languages, translators tend to leave the language more or less intact. So it's possible to identify a paragraph in French being turned into a paragraph in Italian because they don't edit much. They try and keep the translation as straightforward as possible, even when it's moving between kind of across political and confessional, religious boundaries. News moves very freely around early modern Europe in paragraphs, and it makes a kind of network of communication and so of association. And this habit of preserving the metadata, the source information, also served for contemporaries, and I'll come back to this a bit later, a means of tracing the source of news and the movement of news, which was one way of assessing how reliable the news was. So preserving the metadata in news helps you assess whether or not it's credible. So merchants made use of the paragraph form. They wrote letters with paragraphs of news, and diplomats started doing the same thing, and they went a step further. Diplomats needed news, right? Diplomats is the kind of currency of their doing their job. They need not only news from home, but you need news of what's happening elsewhere in Europe, relayed via your home, so you can use it wherever you're stationed. The more news ambassadors and diplomats had, the better they could do their job. States, therefore, beginning in Venice inevitably, began to gather news out of diplomatic reports and then send it back as a series of paragraphs to the same diplomats. So they would gather the news from all of their diplomats and send it back to the same diplomats as a kind of digest. And they devised a form of doing this efficiently as a written letter. The paper usually folded once, so it was 4 or 8 pages long, if it was 2 sheets of paper. And the document had multiple paragraphs of news, again, each with these headings, and they sent them out weekly. It begins in Venice and then it spreads to other states. These documents are impersonal. They don't have a named addressee, they're not signed off, they don't have a distinctive voice. And because the diplomats who devised this form were mostly Italian, they called this form the aviso, and it looks like this. There are 2 examples on the screen of avisi. So this is a weekly digest of paragraphs of news sent initially among diplomats using the technologies of organizing written information devised by merchants. Broadly speaking, we can say that this form, the aviso, was devised and the conventions formulated and consolidated in the second half of the 15th century. So between about 1450 and 1500, we can see this form really becoming widespread around Europe. And then in the first half of the 16th century, they become commercially available to the general public. So if you were literate and you had the money, you could buy every week, though I think most copies were sold by subscription, but you could go out to buy from a newsmonger or a bookseller a weekly handwritten newsletter containing paragraphs of the news of Europe. And it is Europe, and I'll come back to what I mean by Europe. And there are thousands of these circulating around Europe every week. They appear quickly, and they're kind of ordinary. So I'm going to give a couple of examples of early collectors to give some idea of the scale of the business. First, the Fuges brothers, who were merchants and bankers based in Augsburg. This is actually a volume from their library, who collected avisi between 1568 and 1604. Several volumes have been lost, but the surviving 27 bound volumes hold about 16,200 avisi and about another 1,000 documents, accompanying documents. 82% are in German and 17% in Italian. The Fugezeitungen, as they're known, the Fugger's News, are now held at the National Library of Austria, in Vienna. And it used to be thought that this was this amazing, unique collection that was only possible because the Fuggers were so immensely rich, they could devise this great news service just for themselves, and this was a unique collection. In fact, they just sort of bought them from booksellers, and they were available to everyone. Albeit the Fuggers are very good at preserving them. This is my favourite document from the entire collection. It's a watercolour picture of the siege of Antwerp in 1585, showing how boats were put together to form a bridge across the Scheldt. Second example, so that's the Fuggers. The second example would be the House of Medici, an influential dynasty in Florence, of course, who collected from the early 16th century to the mid-18th century a library of 6,500 volumes with around 4 million letters. It's much broader and much less structured than the Fuggerseitungen, and it's not clear yet, after many years of cataloguing, just how many avisi it contains. The last time I looked, I think less than 1% of the total catalogue was available in the online catalogue, and that included 3,000 avisi sent to Florence, containing news from all over Europe and also some from North Africa, mostly in Italian. One of the things that you can see from looking at the Medici's avisi is that there are particular places that operate as hubs in their collection. Places that gather news from surrounding areas and then send it on to Florence. And the important places for sending news to Florence in their collection are Venice, Rome, Amsterdam, and Brussels. These are sort of the great news centres, some of the great news centres of Europe. And what that kind of tells us, I think, is that if you have places that are operating as hubs and gathering local news and then sending it on, you've got what's called in maths a network. You have a highly robust, well-organized system for gathering and storing and communicating information. But I think I can hear you asking already, how does this news actually move? Again, this is a very long history, and I promise you it's really fascinating, but I'm not going to do it here. It's all about postal services. Postal services enable avisi to spread around Europe. So it's between about 1490 and about 1550. So again, the overlapping with the creation and the commercialization of avisi, postal services develop. The first equine or equestrian relay system in Europe appears in 1385 in Milan, apparently imitating the Mamluk post, which Italian merchants had observed in Egypt. That's a very small ducal service. What we see from about 1490 is the creation of national and transnational postal services established by cities and states and kingdoms. And the most famous of these is the Thurn und Taxis or Tassis service within the Holy Roman Empire. These are weekly posts. The weekliness is important. That's the same periodicity as avisi notice. And it changes how you think about things, I think. I mean, it changes your perception of time if you expect every week that you will hear something new from the rest of Europe. Now, initially, postal services are private. They're specifically for the use of the state or the prince or the monarch. But then, for purely financial reasons, because it's really expensive to maintain lots of horses in staging posts, unless you've got some kind of income set against it, gradually states open them up to private users. So we have the foundation of a commercial, public postal service in this period. The post is always subject to search, of course, but it's nonetheless public. This pattern spreads around Europe, and importantly, these posts are connected. It's kind of mind-blowing when I learned this. you can send a letter within one system to reach the terminus of that system, and you wrap it around with a document and include payment, and it then can leapfrog into the next postal system and move further. So it's possible to send letters between Venice and London, moving through multiple postal services. The post, like the news, doesn't respect linguistic or commercial or political or religious boundaries. It connects things. It connects things beyond the intentions of the people who devise it. It has unintended consequences. And so the post creates the material infrastructure of a European communications network. So this postal network spreads newsletters, later newspapers. It spreads the paragraphs of news that make them up. And it also creates, for readers of news, a sense of the community to which they belong. Now, I know that sounds like a big claim, but the longer you sit with it, I promise, the more plausible it seems. So if I'm in Amsterdam, if I'm an Amsterdammer, and I hear a lot of news from, say, Hamburg, and less news from Münster, then Hamburg, even though it's further from Amsterdam, features more prominently in the world as I imagine it. And if the news travels faster from Hamburg than from Münster because there's a direct postal service, then Hamburg surely seems nearer. And this works on an interpersonal level too, I think. If I hear news from Brussels through a friend, then Brussels will seem closer, but so will my friend. And who we are is partly a matter of whom we talk to. Now, I'd like to say a little bit more about the geography. I did tell you I wasted about 20 years of my life doing this, and then come back to the idea of community. I'd like to map the geography of news because I think it tells us something interesting about what Europe is, where Europe is. I said earlier that the preservation of metadata in newspaper reports was a gift to me as an historian because it's possible to harvest and then quantify data about the movement of news, the flows of news, the direction, their weight, their speed. So this is a visual representation of the source of news in every Dutch newspaper printed in the 17th century. It's not that much of a gift, right? Information overload. And this is only Dutch newspapers. There's too much information. But we can begin to break it down and look more closely at how things work. So here, these are the sources of Dutch news, again in printed newspapers, in which the size of the dots is proportionate to the number of paragraphs that are printed throughout the whole of the 17th century. And I think it's just possible, even though it's a great blobby mess, to see that there's a preponderance of news from the Low Countries, the Holy Roman Empire, and northern Italy, and particularly from coastal towns. And interestingly, there's not much news from Spain. And on the eastern edge of Europe, there's a lot from Venice, Vienna, Warsaw, and Danzig, or Gdansk, with Lviv as an outlier, but not much beyond that. This map is still very crowded, and so I'm going to kind of drill down a bit more, look at a more selective range of data. So if we, that also enables us to think about change, about how these patterns of communication might change. So if I narrow it down to the period of the 30 Years' War, so just 1618 to 1648, which is a European war which involves multiple wars, this is what the sources of Dutch news look like. Most of the news comes from the Netherlands and the Holy Roman Empire, which is kind of the center of conflict as well as the Netherlands, while a few cities like Amsterdam and Vienna and Venice and Rome and Prague and Cologne and Paris supply a great deal of news, and Antwerp is not far behind. There are a lot of places that just supply small quantities of news. So they are being brought into a network. There's relatively little news from the Iberian Peninsula, And the map also suggests that outside of the Netherlands, the German states and Central Europe, news tends to come to the Netherlands from coastal towns and to follow waterways. And this is a zoomed-in view of that map, which shows that news flows along the Weser, the Elbe, and the Oder, as well as the Scheldt and Waal deltas. So that's in 1618 to 1648. That's during the 30 Years' War. So if we look very briefly at the next 38 years, 1649 to 1687, there are more items of news in this period. So there's an increase in the quantity of news appearing in the Netherlands. But it also shows that, unsurprisingly, that there's proportionally less news from Central Europe, while there is a diversification of places of origin, including a drift east, and the appearance of news from the Adriatic coast and Greece. So again, if you look at 1618 to 48, and then 1649 to 87, you can see that these centres of news have drifted far to the east in the later period. Now, so far I've been talking about the news from the Low Countries as a whole. We can zoom in for greater detail by picking out particular cities. So this map just looks at Amsterdam. Between 1618 and 1648, there are 21,000 paragraphs of news printed in this period. And this is Antwerp in the same period. So Amsterdam and Antwerp, and they dominate Dutch news in this period. There's a handful of paragraphs from Bruges and Arnhem and Delft and Utrecht and The Hague. After the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, ending the 30 Years' War, the printing of news shifts to Haarlem, in fact, and Antwerp more or less disappears as a centre of news. So, again, Amsterdam and Antwerp. There is a subtle difference here, which I can demonstrate if I do that horrible thing of drawing the lines in again. So, obviously, Amsterdam in the north, Antwerp in the south. And if you look at the concentration of lines of which show news items moving to those cities, traced by the metadata in paragraphs, you'll see that Amsterdam has much more news from the west, but also more from the south and the southeast. Amsterdam is, of course, the Protestant city, centre of the Dutch Republic. Antwerp, Catholic city, Habsburg, Netherlands, has more news from Istanbul and from the south. The news printed in Bruges and Arnhem and Delft and Utrecht comes from a much narrower range of places. So it's really about, until 1648, it's Antwerp and Amsterdam that have a developed infrastructure. And again, this is how networks work. You have a small number of places which are massively well connected, which supply the news to the less well connected places. Now, one of the properties of the network is that what it looks like, even though it's the same network, what it looks like depends on where you stand in it. So let's consider one more example before I step back and think about this issue of community again. And this example is the newsletters from the Fuggers, whom I mentioned earlier, the Fuggerzeitungen. This map shows the origins of all of the newsletters in their collection, which is possible because of a brilliant digitization project run in Vienna. You can see all of these online. And from this, size of the dots proportionate to the number of newsletters, you can see that the chief supplier of news is Rome, Venice, Antwerp, and Cologne. And less regularly, there are letters from Lyon, Vienna, Prague, Istanbul, Frankfurt, and Middelburg. And this changes over time, so there's a gradual reduction over this period, 1568 to 1604. There's a gradual reduction in the newsletters from Istanbul. But that's because Venice takes up the role of supplying news from the Ottoman Empire to the rest of Europe. So more newsletters from Venice, and the news from Istanbul passes through Venice. London initially doesn't appear as a source for news in Augsburg. Sorry, I should repeat, this is news in Augsburg. So we're looking at the perspective from there. London initially doesn't figure. Gradually it becomes important around 1580, and then it disappears. No newsletters from London. But that's because all of the British news is being supplied via Antwerp. So I've suggested that this is a big network sharing news, and that different places in this network can have different perspectives, but also they can perform subtly different roles. So we can see this by isolating all of the newsletters from a particular city being sent to Augsburg and where they're gathering their news in from. Because all of the newsletters from Rome contain paragraphs of news from different cities. So Rome sent 2,166 newsletters to Augsburg in this period, with news from the Roman Curia, the Papal States within the Italian peninsula, from Naples, Florence, Sicily, Milan, Bologna, Sicily, I said Sicily already, Messina, Civitavecchia and Ferrara, but also some news from Spain and France, from Geneva and from the Ottomans and Malta. So if you're in Augsburg, the news of much of Italy comes from Rome and not from Venice. From Venice, the news that's going to Augsburg comes from these areas, much more from the east. So the lesson here is that if you're in the Holy Roman Empire, newsletters from Venice and newsletters from Rome perform different functions. They cover different areas. If you want to have an even spread of news, you don't just get one newsletter. There is no place that supplies all the news that's fit to print. You don't buy the New York Times. You buy a variety of different sources. And this appears very clearly, I think, in a map which shows where the news captured in the newsletters from Lyon and Vienna originates. So again, these are all newsletters to Augsburg. And you'll see on the left the sources from the newsletters from Lyon, and on the right the sources in the newsletters from Vienna. There's almost no overlap. So if you buy a newsletter from Lyon, you get the newsletter, the news from France. And a newsletter from Vienna will supply you with news in the surrounding areas, and particularly to the east. No one tries to supply all of the news in this period. But if you buy multiple newsletters, or if you read multiple newsletters, you can obtain coverage of all of Europe. Europe comes to know itself. But do I mean all of Europe? Where is Europe in this period? Because it's not a political entity. But maybe it is constituted by where we hear the news, or where they heard the news from. So again, if we go back to the spread of news in the written news let me begin that sentence again. If we go back to all of the supplies of news, written news to Augsburg in this period, and think about where it's coming from, and if we look at all the printed news in the 17th century Netherlands, if I was really, really good at this kind of thing, I would obviously make these kind of merge into each other in some way. But what you can see from here, particularly if I spell it out properly, is where the sources of news are. Essentially, east of a line drawn from Venice through Vienna to Krakow, and then veering north to Warsaw and Danzig or Gdansk, is the eastern edge of where you're hearing news from. The news in Europe kind of stops or slows down at that line. There's much less news, and from there it travels more slowly. Again, big dots. Venice, Vienna, Warsaw, Gdansk. So I'll repeat my proposition. This is for readers of news at this time the community to which they think they belong. There is, as my examples from North Africa suggest, news from beyond this central area, but it's less plentiful, it's slower, and so these places seem further away and less connected. Within this area, news is more reliable. It can be conferred because there are usually multiple sources. Readers are able to test it by conferring different newsletters. This is already established as a way of confirming whether news is true or not, is you check multiple sources. And readers are able to check the roots of the news and to see where it comes from, to see whether it's reliable. I'm going to give one example of an editor doing this. I'm trying to teach a reader how to read news. And I realized on the train this morning that it would actually just be insanity for me to read out this passage because it is so hard to parse. But I'm going to try and paraphrase it because it is astonishing, I think. This is a report printed in London in 1622. And the editor's got all of these newsletters together and he digests them and he copies out the interesting paragraphs and sends them to the printing press and they're sold to readers. But he feels he has to teach his readers how to read. So he says that there's news from Graz and Bohemia of the capture of Prague, right? Which news originated in Emmerich. And this seems to be confirmed and extended by another source in London, he says. And Frankfurt merchants in London, he says, say that the same was being spoken of in Frankfurt when they left. But they left when the news was very fresh, so it hadn't been confirmed, and therefore they're not inclined to believe it. Though, when they passed through Vlissingen, Flushing as the English called it, in the Netherlands, it was believed. And so this news is supported by several independent sources. However, he goes on, the usually reliable news entrepôt, Vienna, has not received this news. And some of the key players in the action have not reported it to the emperor. And it seems to the editor that the lack of news, again, no news, the lack of news in Vienna is more weighty than the news reported from elsewhere. But who knows, he says. I'm just going to tell you what I've heard. I'll give you all of the geographical markers and acknowledge that something must have happened. Time and space are mapped out in an account of conflicting sources. And to judge the truthfulness of the rumour, the editor says that he will show the reader what he has, reveals a process of reporting that's unfolding in time. Again, time mark is really important in this context, and exposes a kind of a network of communication underlying all these reports. I think this is something we're not seeing a great deal of in 2026. People did care about whether news was true at this time. The early modern news environment was not some kind of wild west of unsupported opinion and propaganda. The practice of recording times and places at the head of each paragraph expresses, I think, an ingrained culture of skepticism and caution. The news network is devised to convey the news in such a way that its credibility, or the means of assessing its credibility, is preserved in the news itself, in the metadata embedded at the head of the paragraph. This is a system of indicating authority or reliability that records time and geography rather than people and authorities. It's not dependent upon particular forms, it's not dependent on the social standing of the person who does the reporting or of the eyewitness. And so for this reason, while there's plenty of false news in the network at this time, there isn't so much fake news. The paragraph system is designed to reflect fake news, to resist fake news. And so this kind of retention of information about time and place provides a kind of fact-checking equipment embedded in the news itself. And it's the opposite, I think, of modern social media, which tends to obscure sources in a kind of corporate frame, in which news is passed on without a clear sense of its origins or its source. For readers of news, and it's by reading news that you make sense of the world that you live in, Europe didn't have hard boundaries, but it did have centres and peripheries. And to be on the periphery is not necessarily to be geographically remote. It is to have fewer connections, or weak connections, to have slow or irregular posts, to experience a kind of logistical disconnect. That's what it means to be peripheral. And to be a centre is to be well connected. Flows of news are, of course, seldom symmetrical. In London, there's much more news about Antwerp than there is news about London in Antwerp. And there's so much news in Antwerp that the news of London is proportionally smaller. So from the perspective of Antwerp, London seems further away than Antwerp seems from London. I think. So where is Europe? If you look at it from the perspective of whom you hear about, how much you hear about particular places, and from where you hear news about other places from, the centres of Europe were Antwerp, Cologne, Rome and Venice, and then Lyon, Vienna and Prague. On the periphery of Europe were Lisbon, Seville and London, and to the east, the Adriatic coast extending northeast along a line from Venice through Vienna and Krakow to Warsaw, because east of there, in Hungary, Croatia and Transylvania, there's less news, it travels more slowly. Governments there are quite secretive, and the public culture is correspondingly thin in this period. We are whom we speak to. I'm sort of coming towards the end, and I should probably then speak about the thing that I glossed over, and I should apologise for glossing over. In a talk about the birth of news, I kind of overlooked newspapers. I slipped from written news to printed news without a pause, as if printing didn't matter. And it does matter a bit. Printing by movable type, which in Europe begins with Johannes Gutenberg in Mainz between 1452 and 1453, is important. It speeds up the production of texts. It makes text cheaper. It reduces the individual unit costs of text. And in the long run, it affects how we organize things and think about things. But in the history of news, its importance has been vastly overstated, I think. And it's because, to cut a long story short, historians of the news, the first historians of the news, writing in the third quarter of the 19th century, were essentially looking at the news diet around them and trying to write its prehistory. So for them, newspapers were the center of the news universe. And so what they did was trace the genesis of newspapers, looking essentially at what the key elements of the newspapers are, periodicity, publicity, and so on, and then saying, okay, when did these first appear? So they wrote the story backwards, which means that they would not have seen any of that kind of interesting exchange between voice and writing that I was sketching at the start of the paper in my 3 examples from the 15th century. So I feel like I have to say something about the printed newspaper. The printed newspaper begins in 1605, when someone decided to print an aviso. The first printed newspaper is nothing other than a printed weekly manuscript, and that had been happening for over a century. 1605 in Strasbourg, the printer was a man called Johann Carolus, who was a newsletter writer and printer, and he published this first newspaper, the Relation aller Vornehmen und gedenkwürdigen Historien, and it was an aviso with a title page. And the immediate impact was negligible. It was perhaps inevitable that someone would print an aviso at some point, or print it on a weekly basis. Bits have been printed before. Harder to explain, in fact, is why it took anyone so long to do this. And it's possible that Carolus was finding it difficult to keep up with producing enough written newsletters because the aviso business was going so well, and calculated that he would profit more by a printed version. It's possible, I like to think that maybe his press was empty one week, he had no commissions and he didn't know what to do, so he decided to print one. Or it's possible that he saw that resistance to printing avisi, because they contain political information that can be sensitive, was kind of fading, and that he should leap in and do it before anybody else. But curiously, the earliest surviving copy we have of this first newspaper is from 1609. There isn't one for the first 4 years. We only know that it existed in 1605 because Carolus submitted a petition to the city authorities at Strasbourg, asking for a monopoly for 10 years. Now, book survival rates in this period are really, really low, but the fact there is not a single copy for 4 years surviving makes me wonder how many he printed and whether it was successful or not. Anyway, the first newspaper is the printed version of something that was, at this time, old news. Printing had the power to increase the number of copies and reduce the price, but I don't think it did at this stage. In some respects, of course, it slowed the news down because it took a couple of days for you to set the type and to print it. So I think it's important to say that the impact of the printed newspaper at this time was limited. It was a slow burn. I mean, they do spread across Europe over the next 5 decades. But when it appeared in 1605, the printed newspaper was one textual object among others. You might buy that, but you would still buy your aviso or multiple avisi. You would still have your other newsletters, and you have to think back to those Italians in the 15th century who were bringing together and compiling and conferring multiple sources. The newspaper is not a great rupture in the fabric of news communication. It's one little thing among others. Of course, by the middle of the 18th century, newspapers had triumphed in the sense of being plentiful and were read not only by the most educated, but at the same time there are still avisi circulated in the mid-18th century, supplying a more restricted elite or professional audience. So when we think about the history of news and the birth of news, it's essential that we don't think about or don't privilege newspapers. They're a small part in the story. So, I need to say in conclusion why this might matter, to say a little bit about what's new. Between about 1400 and about 1800, there developed a set of technologies, verbal and material, for sharing news. With these, people learned how to manage news, how to deal with information overload. They learned a set of practices for handling and interpreting news. And for the first time in history, people expected news. Ordinary people expected news. News didn't just arrive when somebody passed through town. Instead, there wasn't just a hope, but an understanding that there would be updates at least every week, which would tell you what was happening across Europe, see above, and which might, importantly, confirm or correct or change or amend what you heard last week. The periodicity, the weekly periodicity of news, meant that, again, for the first time, you would hear some news, but you would then expect it to play out in the future. You wouldn't think that the news that you heard today was the end of the story. You assume that there's a kind of continuity over time, and we see this again and again in the way people read and interpret news. The news is something that is unfolding still over time. And this all happened because of the creation of communications networks, of posts, paragraphs, and avisi, scribes and translators, newsmongers, ambassadors, and merchants. No one planned or devised this communications network. It came together through the actions of hundreds of thousands and perhaps millions of men and women each of whom was doing something material and practical in their own world, but they all came together to form a collective enterprise that was pan-European in its being and in its impact. For all of their lack of intention, the outcome of their actions was the creation of a robust and, in some respects, beautiful system of exchange that lasted for about 4 centuries. It would disappear under the weight of nationalism, machine-powered presses, paper that was made from wood pulp, and faster modes of communication. With electrical telegraphy, of course, we have the first news that doesn't have to be conveyed by a moving body. While an unintended network cannot be described as idealistic, I like to look back on this network and think that it does embody a set of ideals. And to that end, I'd like to finish with an extraordinary quotation, I think, and it's the one I use at the very beginning of my book, The Great Exchange. It's written in the 1760s by a Lombard economist and historian. Today I'm going to give him the final words. So he's looking at the culture of news in the middle of the 18th century, and he says, "These news make us almost fellow citizens of all of Europe. They produce continuous commerce between the different nations, and they destroy that distrust and that disdain with which isolated nations regard foreigners. Everything in Europe tends to come closer and to unite, and there is a stronger effort towards equality, which was not there in the past. All of this is due to the community of ideas and of lights and the movement which is discerned in it and which so much disturbs those whose perspectives have been circumscribed for a century, which seems to me similar to that trembling movement which you discern in a liquid before it settles in equilibrium." Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Joad, for tour de force through the Renaissance news from the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, even to the 17th century. So, has the news moved on? You know, if you now take a map of news from the internet, it's very easy to see where all the main sources of news seem to be coming from and going to. But we're starting the room with Renaissance news, so we're starting the room for questions. There's already questions online, but we'll start over there in the room. Bear with me.
How quickly did the news travel?
Good question. The news travelled between 1.5 and 5 kilometres an hour. I can say that with remarkable confidence because I've hacked I've looked at all of that data of news moving, and it seems terribly slow, but that's what you come out at. Interestingly, right? So it all comes down to the size of horses' spleens. Horses have big spleens, they tend to overheat. If you ride a horse too fast, it can't go very far. So from Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, people who've been running equestrian relay services have tried to calculate the optimal speed at which you ride a horse and how long you do it for before you change horses, right? And the answer is from Cyrus the Great, 6th century BCE, to the Overland Pony Express in early 19th century America, the answer is between about 13 and 16 kilometres an hour. So that's the speed at which you ride a horse to convey news. However, then you've got obviously things that slow you down, like changing horses, not being able to travel at nights, bad roads, because the roads in early modern Europe are really, really bad. And so when you look at the actual, and I'm talking now about news moving long distances, so if it's just down the road, it's faster than that. But if it's like 100 kilometres or so, it almost always tends to travel between 1.5 and 5 kilometres an hour. between about 1400 and about 1800. It speeds up a bit towards the end when roads get better. And there are routes like Rome to Venice, which are really fast because the road is good and there are plenty of staging posts. But the news, by our standards, is slow.
Good. You mentioned that people got different sources of news to get the totality of the news. Which language was that written in predominantly in the 15th and 16th, 17th century?
You mean across all of Europe?
Yeah.
Well, all languages.
Was Latin still a predominant?
No, it's vernaculars, generally speaking. So, I mean, there's obviously there's lingua franca. So merchants use this kind of hybrid language called lingua franca, which is, as you can imagine, an amalgamation of Romance languages, which is popular. But generally speaking, most of the sources I've looked at have been German, Italian, French, less Spanish, a little bit of English. I mean, it depends where you are. Almost all of the Medici newsletters I've looked at have been Italian. The Fugazeitung, as I said, 82% German. But it works because there are translators. Now, we tend to think of translators as literary figures, but I think all of the news entrepreneurs of Europe, all of the exchanges, that's another part of this story, is the development of exchanges or bourse across Europe, big buildings that are designed to hold merchants and to kind of provide space for trading and currency exchange and so on. All bourse have jobbing translators hanging out there. And I suspect a large number of merchants are pretty good at undertaking translation. Now, we're not talking about John Florio, you know, we're not talking about literary masterpieces. We are talking about the competent rendering of a text from one language to another to get the meaning across. And I think Europe, some of the great heroes of 17th century Europe that have been neglected are people who were just quite good at languages, who would professionally, as part of another job, doubtless, move text between one language and another. The whole newspaper trade depends on people able to do that.
Thank you. Another question in the room. We probably have another 2 questions in the room and then I'll go online.
Thank you. Do you find much commentary, opinion, slanting, bias in these newsletters, or do they report events by and large neutrally?
Good question, and it's a tricky one, because yes, news is always written from a particular point of view, and so what you might choose to report, and the details that you might include or exclude, shape the reader's opinion, but there's a lot of but there is consensus, I think, that and it's certainly the character of Avisi and early printed newspapers, that the language is fairly calm. So while you might express your political convictions through what you choose to put in and what you don't put in, there isn't a great deal of hot-headed language. That's not what Avisi are like. There are pamphlets produced by the same people, produced by the same printers, that express vituperative polemic. But news reporting tends to be quite calm. There are two interesting adjuncts to that, I think, interesting to me. One is that when people translate, they translate literally, I mentioned earlier. So you know, they don't change a paragraph to alter its meaning or its political bias. The second is that occasionally newsmongers and editors are thrown into prison when they receive a text and change it when they print it. So there is an assumption that you have to be reliable, I guess is the word, when you pass something on. There is an assumption that you shouldn't modify what you have received, because that is the key information. That's the valuable source. You know, we're not interested in what your editorial slant on it is.
It's good to know that there used to be consequences for fake news and untruth. Another question in the room before we go online. This gentleman here. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I notice your maps, very good though they are, they didn't feature any of the Baltic places up in the north very much. During those early periods, was there much activity that was making news from those areas, or were they really remote?
No, there is less news from up there, and I'm afraid that map, and it's a very acute observation. I'm not afraid that wonderful map is drawn by Penguin, and it is largely based on a quite sophisticated count of the number of times places are referenced in the text of my book, which might mean that it's partly my fault for not discussing the Baltic states all that much. But I think it is the case that they are generally disconnected from that core network that I'm describing. I mean, Stockholm gets connected by a postal service I meant to know this and I don't, but at some point in the early 17th century, I think. And there are lots of communications amongst merchants running along that northern coast that tend not to get into the avisi and printed newspapers that I've read. So while there is, while you can find out what's happening there by reading newsletters, they don't appear to be sucked into that kind of the main exchanges of communication. I think. I haven't read every aviso or printed newspaper between 1400 and 1800. A lot of the work I did was based on scraping data from databases. I mean, I read enough to drive me completely insane.
Well, obviously you haven't, so that's good. We need to move on to some of the online questions, because we've only got about 7-8 minutes left of Q&A before we do the book signing. But I want to get a couple of the online questions in. Where did the writers of the newsletters get their information from? Reporters? And did the writers make a judgment of the reliability of their sources?
No and yes. So paragraphs of news originate. I mean, it's often really difficult to pinpoint who wrote something because it's impersonal. But if we're talking about reports of courts, then we are going to be talking about eyewitnesses who are on the peripheries of the court, or we are going to be, if in the case of warfare, it's often officers who send in reports, or they might be secretaries who are involved in governance, who are taking bits of news that have been received by institutions. The early newsmongers are, and I call them newsmongers rather than reporters because they're largely men who gather in public places and speak to people, politicians, senators, sailors, who pass on the news, who bring news to these newsmongers, who then compile paragraphs out of them. Hence, they'll say, I hear news from Crete that arrived in Venice today. So that's the kind of flag for where it will come from. But there aren't professional reporters until much later in this period. But there are newsletter writers, scribes, who hang out in public places, and particularly in the early period, it's going to be harbours and piazzas, Piazze, and in the later period, it's going to be barbers and bookshops and coffee shops, even later still.
Okay, there's plenty of questions coming in online, but unfortunately we probably only have room for one more question, and that is by Paul. Thank you for a fascinating talk. Have you seen hard evidence of English printed newsletters in the last decades of the 16th century? And which organizations delivered the Post in London?
Well, it's the Post Office in London, which was established by Henry VIII. Though, as with any city, the often letters are relayed from the Post Office by amateur or professional couriers. There's a lot of printed news in late 16th century London. I kind of wrote a book about it about 30 years ago, I think. And obviously it's completely feels departed from my memory. But what happens in late 16th century London is the kind of the news culture there is compiled of a mixture of news reports that are taken from avisi, translations from French news pamphlets, and original reports and newsletters written by English authors. It's a kind of confection of different kinds of materials, much of which is translated. So, I mean, the first serial publications, i.e. the first publications which appear as a series of news reports in London, are translations of French news pamphlets from the 1590s. The English are kind of slow to start printing the news that's available from the great European news network. That doesn't really begin until about 1618, so it's James VI and first rather than Elizabeth. I'm not sure what that question's getting at. I wish he was here so we could have a conversation.
Next time. Unfortunately, we have to draw things to a conclusion so that Joad, you can sign some books. But please put your hands together for Joad and an excellent talk tonight.